this podcast is not going to have a happy ending. Spoiler alert. Corey, I have a question for you. What was the most surprising thing you've come across during your time with Ketogeek?
I have to say, it was the discovery of Michael Arnstein, the fruitarian.
The guy who was running on fruit?
Yeah, literally running ultra marathons on nothing but fruit.
Well, for me, besides the fruit and meat only diet, coming across this paper that we're going to talk about today was. Welcome to the Ketogeek podcast. Let's do this.
Health, nutrition, fitness, low-carb lifestyle.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Ketogeek podcast. We've been taking such a huge break. Last week's show was amazing. I had a good time. What about you, Corey?
Had a great time. I'm so excited to have the Ketogeek podcast back and Ketogeek resurrecting and bringing some beautiful things to the table, which we'll talk about in just a second.
Yes, and we've had some really positive feedback, and I'm really enjoying this groove. I'm really enjoying how we've evolved, and from where we started off, we've become a lot smarter. We've developed some sharper tools to understand what's going on in the world of food, nutrition, health, and I guess just in life in general. But, Corey, I have the most difficult question for you.
Go ahead and shoot.
What is Ketogeek?
Oh, Ketogeek. If you haven't heard of what Ketogeek is, we are a food and nutrition company that is just diving into the world of health by food intake. To put it simply, we like to develop products that are produced by our knowledge that we've gained from research and talking to amazing people on this podcast, bringing you things like Ketogeek ghee, Ketogeek energy pods, and possibly more to come in the future.
And those energy pods, now that you talk about them, they are those amazing sugar-free tiny little cups that will curb stop your hunger. I personally made them for myself and decided to share with a bunch of yoga ladies, and from that point, it was a love story written in the books. And it is made using the ghee that we make at our own place. Isn't that kind of cool? We create our own raw ingredients, man. It contains MCT oil, some proteins, and literally the best ingredients that we can find. And so everybody who's been consuming them, they just love them. I wouldn't say like it's 100%, but I would say most of the people, they just love them. They take them with them anywhere they have to go. They're completely shelf stable. They are just going to get you hooked. And it's the best way to eat chocolate. I think it's the best way you can eat chocolate. I'm probably biased, but I think so too. And speaking of our energy pods, Chocolate Fudge has a launch date now, relaunch date. We will be back in stock with a Chocolate Fudge Energy Pod this Thursday. What's the date on this Thursday?
The date on this Thursday?
I think it's 8th.
Thursday the 8th, yeah.
Thursday the 8th. If it's not 8th, it is 7th or 8th. I think it's 8th. Oh man, I've lost track of time. It's just everything's just going so fast, like post-COVID, just getting all the business going. But all I know is this Thursday, you're going to get the energy pods back, especially just the chocolate fudge for now. And slowly we will bring in more flavors, which is something interesting. Something interesting is brewing on. Some of you Instagrammers saw a snippet of it. What was it, Corey?
Oh man, that was the strawberry prototype that you guys saw on that Instagram story. And thank you so much for checking that out and keeping up with the times at Ketogeek. We really love to see you guys still tuning in to the Ketogeek podcast, still tuning in to the Ketogeek Instagram and any social media platform you possibly can engage on. Thank you so much.
And you know what's cool about the energy pods? Just to kind of sidetrack about it, we did some slight modifications and it's a little bit more shelf stable. You're going to find out, and we're going to do like this Instagram story where you're going to see how the texture has kind of evolved from where we started off. And so we're working on creating the energy pods in a way that if you're in an extreme environment, like for example, if it's extremely cold, it doesn't turn into ice crystals. Like a lot of frozen products can turn into these icy crystalline structure, which is just not palatable, man. And then at very high temperatures, it melts and breaks into tiny little pieces. The fat goes to the north and the almond flour just goes to the south, and everybody's just in a different continent, man.
Yeah, the separation thing, that was one of the issues we had with the prototypes of the Ketogeek energy pods, and through research and some disciplined measurements that we've been making in this kitchen, we have stabilized the energy pods to a point where hopefully you will not have to stir so vigorously anymore.
Yep, and I would define the new texture is fattier than fat. So that's how it's going to be. And you're going to try it in just a bit after this show, and people on Instagram are going to see what's going on. So ghee is already in stock. It was there on Thursday, 1st of July, thanks to everybody who ordered right away. So you guys rock. And if you want the best ghee made from the best ingredients, go buy our Ketogeek, ghee on Ketogeek.com. You guys are amazing. It supports this podcast. It supports all the work we do. It supports all the research we do. And speaking of research, today is very, very research heavy, man. Today, all of you guys are going to get a glimpse of the insane amount of depth of knowledge that we go down to, just like a tip of the iceberg of how crazy we are when it comes to science. And we like to actively falsify ourselves when it comes to knowledge. And you will find out we're gonna go all over the place. Tour de nutrition. Something like that, right? Okay. So let's get to it. And we would like to point out that this is more of a historical approach towards nutrition. We're going to go and travel over the last century, where science has moved from metabolic signals that initiated eating events to gut endocrine signals, and then moved to a more recent approach towards the brain, where we talk about the reward signals elicited by these macronutrients that we're going to talk about. So this was initially brought up by this one study that I came across 2 years ago, and it's called the Macronutrients, Appetite, and Energy Intake. And one of the writers on it is Dr. Richard D. Mattis. He is part of Purdue University, and I think he's still there. And all of the work that I've seen of him is just phenomenal work. And so as soon as I saw this paper, it just shattered everything I knew about nutrition. I had to just kind of go back here. And so, Corey, I know I'll be talking a lot about the science because I had to just go to the end of it, but you're welcome to just interrupt me whenever you want or clarify something or just pick up the pieces. Because this podcast, we just literally are paraphrasing / reading straight from the paper. So all the credit goes to the author of the paper. I will reference it. And so just assume that all of it just goes to them. And we're just trying to simplify it. And the reason why we're doing this paper is because it's just so phenomenal. But when I did send an invite to Dr. Richard, and he's probably a busy guy, and so I didn't get a response. But this paper deserves a lot of attention, man. And so there's more authors on there. You guys can check it all out. And so this is going to be really controversial, but I don't think science should be that controversial per se. So you got any comments, Corey, on this?
Well, I've got to say that science does like to contradict itself, it seems. We like to try to falsify the thing that we already figured out and see if we can improve upon it. And that's what I really like about this. And we're about to do a deep dive into this on this podcast, and it's going to be wonderful.
Yes, so my recommendation now is to isolate yourself, find yourself in a place where you can really understand what we're going to talk about. There's going to be a lot of content thrown away. Approach this with an open mind and assume that you know nothing about nutrition. Because the way this paper blew me out, I literally have to just rethink the whole thing. And when we started Ketogeek, Corey, you remember, we said we're going to go to the end of the world to find out what we can. And Dr. Mattis and all of these people, I don't really see them on Instagram or any of the social media. So just as a forewarning, not a forewarning, but just saying that the best scientists don't have to have the most amount of followers. So just be careful about that when you go to social media. Sometimes the most talking loud heads can be a source of misinformation. So be very careful. And you'll find in this show that we literally do falsify some of the things that we've talked in the past as well. So this is another step of evolution for all of us, including you guys as listeners. And thank you so much for joining us. And another thing, I think, Corey, you can talk about what we're going to have a problem with.
Well, pardon our pronunciation, as we are the readers, but you're welcome to laugh at us as we butcher the crap out of these biological terms. We didn't go to university for this stuff, and we haven't really heard people pronounce these words, but bear with us.
Let the butchering begin! Let's just start by saying that each of the macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fat, they all have a unique set of properties that influence health, but all of them are also a source of energy. Throughout our past, the consensus has been a little difficult to achieve when it comes to most topics in the world of field of nutrition, and the target just seems to be evading further. And this is further muddied by our imperfect knowledge of the function of human somatic cells and the growing recognition of contribution of other factors such as genetics, epigenetics, the gut microbiome, and potentially even behavioral inputs. So establishing this whole cause and effect is a bit of a challenge right now. There's so many paths you can take. So it's getting more and more elusive. One area, however, in the world of food, of nutrition, and health is that the body weight is a function of energy balance. The whole calorie in, calorie out, energy in, energy out. It's literally the laws of thermodynamics. And there's also this evolving acceptance that this is truly based on energy itself rather than its source. Furthermore, body weight can be gained, lost, maintained on diets that are varying in macronutrient composition. For example, Corey, what kind of diet did we start off with?
We started off with the most obvious. Look at the name of the show. It's Ketogeek. We started off with a ketogenic diet. Myself, I came off of a vegetarian diet and tried keto vegetarian and decided I needed to change some stuff up and include other foods because the goal I was not attaining correctly and wasn't feeling that great. So we evolved. And how did you start off on this, Fahad?
Man, I started off with keto as well. I was listening to Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, and he was on Tim Ferriss's show. He just gets a plug every time when everybody asks me, how did you start this journey? It's like free marketing, free publicity, Dr. Dominic. He's doing a great work, though. Thank you for putting me on this path. But that was my journey, but it has evolved so much. I would say I'm still sort of like a low carb, but not like super keto at this moment.
Right. I have to agree on that. I'm low carb and feel like it's moderate fat, but I like to focus on protein and finding foods that help me feel satiated. So I'm not taking more energy in throughout the day, especially those late night munchies that some of us can get after especially a long day of work.
Yeah, munchies, man. Food. But going back to the whole thing, it's the energy balance is the corner, no, not the corner, but the centerpiece of the entire show. And going back again, it is well known that energy yield from each macronutrient differs. And to put it very roughly, 9 grams are from fat, 9 calories per gram from fat, 4 calories per gram from protein, and 4 for fat. This is a very simplified version of putting it because, as we understand, a lot of people who are listening to this show are just commuting on their way to work, or they just want a simpler solution. So our goal is right now here is not to convince the extreme scientists, but to keep things really simple and try to explain to the general masses. But the main question, however, still remains that whether there are some unique properties of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates that hold particular implications when it comes to energy balance. And we've heard that a lot of the times. We've heard, Corey, we've heard the whole carbohydrate-driven approach, like a fat-driven approach. You ask anybody, and then there's the protein-driven approach. We got all these kind of ones, unless there's the breatharians, aren't they?
Yes, you sometimes come across the breatharians, people who perhaps even stare at the sun for food, which is interesting.
Captain Planet.
Superman.
Superman as well. I don't know if any other superhero has sun-derived powers.
Let's become those superheroes, yeah?
Yeah. Technically, the Earth is kind of relying on the sun as well.
Very true.
Very reliant.
Very true.
So let's go back to the history. In the period from the 1950s to the 70s, the emphasis was on metabolism with the proposal of a glucostatic, aminostatic, and lipostatic theories of predominating. And we're going to explain this, what all of this is. Each of these different views was largely based on a model where a decrease of one nutrient or a metabolite signaled the need for an increase of energy intake. Hence, the regulation of energy intake was largely based on a signal that initiated some sort of an eating event. This sensation, as most of you might have figured out or not figured out, is called hunger. The emphasis on hunger and meal initiation was logical at that time when obesity and being overweight was not a big health concern. It wasn't that much, right? In the 50s and the 70s, it wasn't that big.
Didn't seem like it, no. Then again, that's just showcasing how little we know about what's actually going on in our bodies and what types of foods we put in there.
Yep. And at that time, interestingly enough, federal dietary recommendations emphasized obtaining enough energy. It follows that eating frequency was then viewed as a primary driver of energy intake. This set of theories lost its favor, however, in part because of their predictive power for energy intake was limited. This is not surprising, however, given that eating frequency is only half of the equation that defines total energy intake. The other half entails portion size, and this is where this whole research field moved from during the 70s to the 2000s. And during these 70s and the 2000s, there was a greater emphasis on gut signaling and its influence on appetite and feeding. Numerous gut peptides were identified, and evidence emerged that as nutrients entered the gastrointestinal tract, meaning all the way from our stomach, mouth, like this whole tract, this whole pipeline, man, this whole pipeline, all the way down to you throwing food out of your body from the bottom part of your body. They stimulated secretion of hormones, leading to sensations of satiation or fullness that prompted the termination of the eating event. Except, of course, ghrelin was an exception to this. The orientation towards signals to terminate eating events again fit the times, as this was an era when the prevalence of overweight obesity increased markedly, like the 70s and the 2000s, and federal dietary recommendations shifted to warn against eating in excess of energy needs. However, the primary focus on portion size also resulted in limited predictive power for human energy intake, with recognition that decades of research had not yielded dietary recommendations that most of the population would follow. Like, people really do ignore all these dietary guidelines. Honestly, they do. Nobody cares. And so this also explains the poor adherence were sought. The increased understanding of gut signaling systems, identification of taste receptors all the way in the GI tract and elsewhere, and advances in neural imaging capabilities led to a reorientation towards the brain. So, as you're noticing, Corey, over here, we're going from metabolism to the endocrine system, and now we're focusing on the brain as well. Like, we're throwing everything here. So, more specifically, attention turned towards the reward centers that reportedly drive excessive intake. The brain has always been implicated in metabolic and endocrine theories of feeding, but it did not play the central maladaptive role it is ascribed right now. In this latest trend, the role of macronutrients shifted from their contribution to homeostasis, which is reaching a sort of a balanced homeostasis. Do you have a better word for that?
I think balance is a very easy and simple way to put it for our audience. Balance in our bodies, meaning that we have a symphony of things that help our bodies run during the day are in a beautiful crescendo.
Like Thanos, perfectly balanced as all things should be.
And then the snap comes.
Oh, man. I remember that video and that podcast as well.
Indeed.
We did that. So the contribution to homeostasis is providing signals that provoke dysfunctional eating and addictive ingestive behaviors with consequent health complications. So we're going to talk a lot about all of this, but in this episode, we will mostly, like I said, we were going to focus on the metabolic responses. And then in the next episode, we will get into the endocrine responses. And then in the future, in the third part, we're going to focus on the brain, the neural responses. So this is very interesting. Let's start off with the carbohydrates, as is done in this paper as well. So at the start, at the beginning of time, not that bad, but at the start, the glucostatic theory of food intake regulation stemmed from the recognition that the body has a limited capacity for carbohydrate storage, but requires a constant glucose supply for the central nervous system. You might have heard of that one. And in the brain, you have the lateral hypothalamus that responds to internal or external stimulation that causes you to be hungry. While once you've eaten, the ventromedial hypothalamus sends signals telling you that you're full and had enough of food. So we have the LH and the VH for short terms, but I'm going to still try to use the bigger terms. The lateral hypothalamus was considered the hunger center, therefore, and the ventromedial hypothalamus was considered the satiety center. Hence, the lateral and ventromedial hypothalamus were hypothesized to contain glucoreceptors sensitive to changes in circulating carbohydrate concentrations, measurable in differences in the circulating arteriovenous glucose concentrations. Arteriovenous means basically your arteries and veins. Considerable evidence supported this theory, and neural activity was observed in the ventromedial or the satiety center upon glucose administration, and in the lateral or the hunger center hypothalamus with insulin administration, while neither isolated protein or isolated or fat emulsion had such an effect. So it seemed obvious at that point that, it's the carbohydrates, could be that, right? Furthermore, it was noted that the damage to the ventromedial hypothalamus or lowering of the blood glucose concentrations prompted food intake, while damage to the lateral hypothalamus produced aphasia, aka excessive food intake, or anorexia, aka reduced food intake. So in other words, hunger was viewed as a mechanism for regulating stable glucose levels. Hunger, following insulin administration, was suggested as a homeostatic response against lower than normal blood sugar levels, aka hypoglycemia, and introduced the possibility of the hormonal influences on the central nervous system's glucoreceptors. However, the scientific favor for this theory started to wane as the larger picture emerged. So the emphasis on the hypothalamic glucoreceptors was diminished by evidence that brain glucose concentrations are unlikely to fluctuate widely in the short term, and arguments that glucostasis is not the primary goal of feeding. Particularly problematic was the theory's inability to explain why hyperglycemia or above normal blood sugar levels did not lead to decreased food intake in animals or lower hunger and food intake in humans. So there were also some numerous rodent studies that casted doubt on the presence of hypothalamic glucoreceptors and arteriovenous glucose differences as key mechanisms controlling food intake. So you start seeing the picture over here, how we're consistently actively falsifying everything that we already knew or we were told at the start of our Ketogeek journey. The theory also did not satisfactorily explain the observation that epinephrine administration quickly triggers hyperglycemia while concurrently reducing hunger without causing a difference in blood glucose levels. Corey, interesting, ain't it?
Indeed.
So, additionally, it was also noted in humans that hunger and hyperphagia occurred with hyperglycemia or lower than normal blood sugar levels in diabetes mellitus. So there's that contradiction now. To account for this, the theory was then modified to propose that hunger in this instance was due to reduction in glucose utilization as a result of abnormal carbohydrate metabolism rather than blood glucose ups and downs or fluctuations. So there's that. The whole blood glucose going up and down, man. Doesn't work.
Nope.
It's kind of fishy.
Well, it's a little bit too of a simple of a system, in my opinion. It goes up and then it goes down. And we know that the body is so much more complicated than that. Just ask your local physician.
Yeah. Hopefully they know about it. I'm hoping they know everything about it.
Crossing the fingers.
Crossing the fingers and toes. Another iteration of this theory Not Fury. Did I say Fury?
You said Nick Fury. No, you did not. The theory was modified.
I apologize every time I say Fury instead of theory. Anyway, another iteration of the theory focused on glycogen balance and considered glycogenolysis as the primary determinant of food intake and body weight. And what exactly is glycogenolysis? It is the process by which glycogen, primarily carbohydrates that are stored in the liver and muscle, is broken down to glucose for immediate energy and maintaining blood glucose levels during fasting. So, for example, you're running a marathon, that's where this starts kicking in. Or what other things do you got, man?
I'm pretty sure it's going to happen on any level of excessive energy expenditure. And the body's just going to say, well, the gas tank's getting low and we're going to have to start drawing off those reserves.
So we kind of need that glucose. But then that's a whole new topic. But this is just to keep things very, very simple over here. This view derived from evidence that liver glycogen levels in mice tended to be lower prior to feeding, indicating a possible effect on food intake and timing of meal initiation. Because glycogen stores are generally not saturated with a maintenance range of 200 to 500 grams, it was thought that carbohydrate intake and its contribution to energy maintenance varied to ensure carbohydrate balance. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. I think we're going to say that a lot here.
Thanos never goes away.
That was a good movie, man. It's a good movie. Anyway, however, the body's ability to adjust substrates, not just carbohydrates, for energy utilization did not support a requirement for maintaining carbohydrate storage as an element of food intake regulation. So throughout its history, the primary focus on carbohydrate/glucose modulation of ingestive behaviors and body weight centered on signals that initiated eating events. And then the continuous monitoring of blood glucose concentrations, like the CGM monitors. That's the same thing. It's kind of like saying DC Universe. Anyway, too much nerdiness. CGM in rats and humans led us to the concept that short-term duration blood glucose dips act as a short-term signal to initiate feeding. Now, this is a very common one in the keto and low-carb community, that if you hit a low dip in glucose, you're going to start feeling hungry. That's a big misconception over here. And we have to actively say that this is probably not true or reliable in that regards. So, as stated in the paper again, however, spontaneous meal initiation did not always occur following such a dip, as noted in one randomized crossover study with 15 overweight male subjects, and meal initiation frequently occurred without a change in blood glucose. So, strong evidence also exists against this hypothesis are these euglycemic clamp studies that show independent manipulation of glucose or insulin does not alter appetitive ratings, whether you're feeling full, hungry, and all those kind of things. The proof of this was obtained from a short-term study of 14 fasting young adults that received infusions of insulin, but there was no effect on hunger, fullness, duration of eating, weight, energy content, and food composition. None of this stuff was noticed. The conclusion of this study was that in the absence of altered blood glucose concentrations, normal and physiological, not just a lot of interventions going on over here, just normal stuff. Normal concentrations of insulin are unlikely to play a role in meal termination and short-term control of appetite. Now, this stings to people who are in the low-carb and keto community, because this is something that is also a big misconception, and there is some evidence suggesting the opposite of that. So active falsification, that's, I think, very important.
Right.
Nevertheless, this hypothesis continues to impact the direction of carbohydrate research in relation to human feeding. More recently, we have these low glycemic index foods, as most of you people have heard, which have been purported to reduce appetite and increase satiety. You know, like the potato thing. Mm-hmm. So, though reducing available carbohydrate lowers glycemic and insulinemic responses, low GI foods per se do not reliably reduce subjective hunger or increase satiety, nor is the glycemic index predictive of appetitive sensations. In one case, there was this one study cited over here, which was a randomized crossover study, which is a pretty strong study, which means that everybody's randomized and not the audience, but the subjects were switched from one part of the intervention to another one, the same people. So this consisted of 26 overweight or obese adults that received either a high glycemic index diet, low carbohydrate, high glycemic index diet, a low glycemic, high carbohydrate diet, and then a low glycemic, low carbohydrate diet. Though the carbohydrate content and glycemic index reduced glycemic and insulin responses after the meal used in the study, no difference in satiety or hunger was noticed. So in the end, it's good for lowering blood glucose and insulin levels, but when it comes to energy intake, it really didn't play that much of a role. So even now, as you know, Corey, that the glucostatic theory is still espoused by a lot of people. However, strong evidence, as we just came across, challenging its importance under physiological and normal conditions has been relegated to a lesser status that it was once held. What do you think, man? This is it when it comes to carbohydrates.
So interesting. And especially that very last part, low GI foods per se do not reliably reduce subjective hunger or increase satiety. We thought that the GI, or the glycemic index, is a reliable predictor of the rise and fall of blood glucose being linked directly to how you feel, whether you're hungry or whether you're not. I'll just use an extreme example of a marshmallow, which is practically just pure glucose. You consume that, it's going to shoot up your blood glucose levels. We expect a energy rise, and then we see an energy fall shortly after that happens. However, this doesn't reliably predict whether we're going to choose to eat more or not later in the day.
Yeah, I think, yeah, sort of, kind of. But there's just so many of these paradoxes that exist over here that is just, it's mind-blowing to a large extent. And so eventually I'm going to start pushing towards the concept of food structure and architecture, which I've teased so many times. It just really deserves a podcast. But bear with me on these next 2-3 shows, because we are going to delve further, deeper into this paper and add some extra fluff to it and explain to you why we are not so convinced by a lot of the nutrition research that is going on these days. And I think this is a perfect time to go into the metabolic responses when it comes to the protein.
Oh, it's our favorite.
Protein.
Protein is king.
That's what they tell you. That's what the fitness community tells you. This is like the holy grail of the fitness and health world. Fat, carb, bad. Protein is the winner. Unless you ask the vegans. The vegans think too much protein is just bad and poisonous. Well, it depends on the vegan, I guess. But protein is important. All of these nutrients are important. We don't dismiss them. None of this stuff is bad or evil. You just gotta understand it. And like we talked in the last podcast, you gotta create the perfect jigsaw puzzle for your health. It's your journey.
They all have a role to play, and we just have to understand their role to the tiniest details.
Yep. The goal, once again, over here is not to create fear of a certain macronutrient. It's to explain and understand so you can embrace it better and apply it to your life. That's the most important thing over here. So protein, the great protein. Let's go back to the paper. Evidence supporting a link between dietary protein consumption and appetite was formalized as the aminostatic theory of feeding. It was noted that an inverse association between blood amino acid concentrations and reports of hunger. Inverse association, of course, means if one thing goes up, the other one goes down. So if blood amino acid concentration went up, their hunger went down. That's what they thought. In its original conception, it was a mechanism focused on eating frequency. And then building on this theory, it was concluded that the relationship between dietary protein and appetite involved more than just circulating amino acid concentrations, because reported hunger ratings remained low after amino acid concentrations returned to their normal basal levels. So there you have it. Further, fasting amino acid concentrations are not predictive of hunger sensations. Nevertheless, a central role for protein in maintenance of energy balance has received considerable support. Some work indicates that rodents, when fed a protein-deficient diet, or animals experiencing protein stress, aka pregnancy, for example, spontaneously select high-protein diets under choice feeding conditions, meaning that they were given the choice. So they chose protein in those studies. Such a specific appetite does not exist for fat or carbohydrates. Among humans, both children and elderly with compromised protein status express a preference for soup containing casein hydrolysate compared to soup alone, despite its strong, bitter taste. Right now, it's all about protein works, right? Mm-hmm. And as if anybody doesn't know, casein is basically the main protein present in milk, and casein hydrolysate is a hydrolyzed version of it, and hydrolyzed means dissolved in water, basically, in a very simple way. Other work with healthy humans indicate that high protein intake results in lower hunger, while low protein intake promotes the desire to eat protein-containing savory foods. So right now we're still handy and dandy. At the population level, protein intake is strikingly consistent, meaning in observational studies, they probably noticed that, strikingly consistent cross-culturally, unlike carbohydrates and fats, which kind of like go up and down, and has remained so over the recent 3 decades of markedly increased overweight and obesity incidences in United States. So right now we're saying proteins just stayed that way, you know? So let's focus on protein, while everything, fat and sugars, just going to keep going up and up. Mm-hmm. So that's what they're saying over here. The aforementioned observations suggest a biological basis for regulation based on protein, and this culminated in the proposition of the drum rolls. We're very familiar with this one.
Oh, man.
It
protein.
Is the
leveraging hypothesis.
Epic. We don't have a sound system. We need a sound guy. You guys need to buy our products and stuff. We're talking about fat while we're talking about protein. Such hypocrites. But go buy our products so we can buy these. We can hire somebody to play these musical numbers and support this podcast and show. Really appreciate that. But let's go back to the PLH, or the protein leverage hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, when the proportion of protein needs are not met in your diet or whatever you're eating, food intake will increase until an appropriate amount of protein is ingested. Conversely, protein-rich diets are purportedly ingested in low quantity, as they provide the requisite amount of protein with relatively less total energy. Makes sense, right?
Interesting. Well, you remember back in the day, we picked up some pure protein isolate drinks. Do you remember these, Fahad?
Oh, we're going to get to it. Don't worry, man.
Oh, yes.
Right now, like I said, right now we're acknowledging why people came to the conclusion.
Just to plant the seed, though.
Yeah. Some people know where this is going to be. And what's interesting is that theory was also explained in this paper. This paper was what prompted me to buy those protein waters.
Haha.
So this is the heart of my beginning of the U-turn in nutrition and food research. So where were we, man?
When protein in rodent meals.
So yeah, when protein in rodent meals is low or essential amino acids are imbalanced, mice consume more energy to compensate and reach a level of adequate protein intake. This phenomena has been replicated in numerous species. However, not in humans. Direct assessment of protein leveraging using diets containing 5 to 10%, 15%, and 25 to 30% of energy from protein, as well as protein from animals and plant sources, have yielded a uniformly negative findings. There you go. One trial even noted a small increase in energy intake on a diet containing 10% from protein, but no reduction of intake with a 25%. So it works in the other way around as well. So if you're lowering, then you should notice that too. The two other trials reported the opposite, a small reduction on a 30% protein-derived energy diet, but no increment on a 5% energy from protein diet. One possible explanation for this failure to document protein leveraging hypothesis is that the protein's role is overridden by other interrelated factors such as protein sources, the food form, and protein quality. Consistent with the original findings, rapidly absorbed protein sources have been associated with stronger satiety than more slowly absorbed sources. Whey protein versus the casein. Whey is faster, casein is a bit slower. The former leads to higher acute post-meal circulating amino acid concentration. We're talking about whey protein here, thus implicating protein digestibility. However, for some dietary protein sources, such as fish, slower digestion and delayed peak of the plasma amino acid concentrations have been proposed as explanations for protein satiety effect. Other work fails to reveal protein sources differences on satiety. These inconsistent findings indicate a single property such as digestibility or absolute blood amino acid concentrations cannot fully account for protein's effect on appetite. Therefore, a protein satiety threshold was proposed but not confirmed. The concept of a satiety ceiling effect, meaning that you eat protein till you hit a certain mark, and above that, it's just doesn't really matter that much. So the concept of the satiety ceiling effect is also under consideration. In some instances, pure protein loads are studied, but this would rarely occur in customary dietary conditions. Like people, a lot of the times across the globe, not just the fitness community, they're not chugging protein shakes. There are limited data on a minimum quantity or increment required to decrease hunger or induce satiety. The importance of protein's food delivery system also reveals that an independent effect of protein is not robust. When protein is ingested through a beverage, its reported stronger satiety effect relative to carbohydrate or fat is diminished or lost. They're basically very similar to each other once you consume a beverage. So nobody wins. One argument for the food form findings is generally low concentration of protein in beverages relative to what may be present in solid food. That's what they think. Though some work reveals a positive association between the protein content of a beverage and its ability to reduce hunger, other work where higher concentrations of protein has been tested does not support a strong protein satiety effect. So you kind of like nullified that last point. Mm-hmm. Additionally, feeding predominantly protein, carbohydrate, or fat-containing beverages, note beverages, does not differentially affect subsequent energy intake. Once again, we go back to the beverage. Given these variable findings, another aspect of protein metabolism, such as the diet-induced thermogenesis and protein's effect on maintenance of lean body mass, was with implications for resting energy expenditure, have been explored. So you might have noticed that one too. The whole thermogenesis because of the protein. Though outside the scope of this paper, it may be noted that a 2-week controlled feeding intervention trial revealed participants maintained weight on a 2-fold higher protein diet, 15% versus 30% energy, compared to diet matched on energy despite greater diet-induced thermogenesis. Okay, so when switched to a higher protein, all-you-can-eat sort of diet, participants lost a significant amount of weight as a result of reduced energy intake. These observations do not support a strong effect of protein's thermogenic effect of food, or TEF, property on body weight. Others reviewing long-term dietary interventions also concluded that the thermogenic effect of food of high-protein diets is unlikely to contribute substantially to weight loss. That's a very important point over here to note. People say something happens, like there's a common theme around fasting and autophagy. I don't know how prominent it is. We kind of took a 1-year break. We don't know what's going on these days when it comes to fasting, but there's that autophagy thing. The first question you should ask is, how substantial is it? How do you measure it? It's kind of like somebody telling you, giving you a call, Corey, and saying, something fell on your house. Okay, what was it? Was it a pebble? Or was it a tree? Should I be worried or not worried? If it's a pebble, I really don't care.
Right.
So there's that whole thing. You have something to add?
Let's move on, my friend.
All right. So there is clear evidence that high protein, energy restricted diets do lead to weight loss when it comes to lean body mass. Maintenance of higher levels of metabolically active tissue should aid in energy expenditure and moderate weight gain or aid weight loss. However, these effects are small. Both of these latter explanations are dependent on marked elevations of energy intake. Example, tripling from 10% to 30% of dietary energy from protein, which have not been proven feasible on a chronic basis in a large proportion of the population. Even then, I think that 30% increase from 10% is kind of, there are issues with that. Like, how are you increasing it? Are you chugging down protein shakes? Are you just going to make protein puddings out of everything? So it depends. And once again, we're still continuing to chug more and more towards the whole food architecture concept. Mm-hmm. So you notice that like the thermic effect is a big thing in the health community. It's overblown. And then, of course, there's the protein leveraging hypothesis that just got dismissed over here. So all of these things that we knew, that we were told, are kind of, there's evidence against that.
Yeah. And maybe that has some sort of, I don't know, science fiction appeal to it. And that's why people want to attach themselves to these things. And they're pretty simple mechanisms to understand on the surface. But once you start to uncover it and put it through the throes of testing, it's no longer so consistent. I mean, maybe it's because we're not considering some very important variables.
Indeed, my friend. I think it's about to beat down on our friend. On our friend that has been with us since Ketogeek, man.
Oh, not fat. Come on, man.
No, we have to.
Okay, let's go.
All right, so metabolic responses to poor old fat. Can we at least fake being biased? I mean, we kind of are biased. Can we like exaggerate the bias somehow? And nah, let's just
free the fat, yo. Free the fat.
Free the fat. Or be like Twitter people where you give reason and they just insult you or label you with all sorts of judgments.
Holy moly.
Just treat the paper like that. Instead of reasoning, give them insults.
Yeah, let's just throw some bananas at it.
Yeah. Throw bananas for insulting fat.
That's right. Carbohydrates.
Have more of these carbohydrates, my friend. I sound like a Russian there. Anyway. In 1953, it was proposed that the hypothalamic control, and I'm purposely not naming scientists over here that were named in the original paper. You guys can totally check out the paper itself, but just because I don't want to name names. So in 1953, it was proposed that the hypothalamic control of food intake was regulated by a lipostatic mechanism designed to prevent excessive fat storage. Parabiotic studies in mice, and these are some really interesting studies. These are studies in which mice are joined together surgically and they share the same blood circulation. So in these studies performed years later, it provided evidence of a circulating factor secreted in direct proportion to fat mass that regulates body mass in long-term basis. Can you make a wild guess what it is? I think you can technically read it, but
I don't know. Maybe it's leptin.
Oh, damn it.
Boom.
You guessed it on the first try. How could you? It's like the next line. That factor, now known as leptin, was cloned in 1994, followed by the cloning of its receptors in 1995. Soon after, circulating concentrations of leptin were shown to correlate with fat mass in both rodents and humans, providing further support for the lipostatic theory of regulation. And leptin is a big thing. You might have heard it thrown all over in our low-carb and keto world, and even just generally in any sort of health community or health cult. There is strong evidence both supporting and refuting leptin's influence on appetite, energy intake, and body weight. The most compelling positive findings derive from studies in leptin-deficient rodents and humans. Administering leptin to mice that is mutated to eat excessively results in reduced food intake and weight loss, mainly due mainly fat loss, not the other stuff, just fat mass loss.
Right.
Administration of leptin to children with leptin deficiency results in decreased food intake and significant weight loss, mainly fat mass again. These effects indicate leptin signaling can impact both food intake and fat storage. However, the majority individuals with obesity have elevated circulating leptin concentrations and develop leptin resistance, resulting in a poor and inconsistent response to leptin administration. So there's a fundamental flaw right there. Evidence opposing the role of leptin as a long-term regulator of fat mass has also been provided both by rodents and human studies. Although serum leptin is elevated in overfed rats, concentrations return to normal within 2 days after the overfeeding stops, while decreased food intake persists beyond this time. In addition, overfeeding obese rats that lack functional leptin receptors still induces a subsequent decrease in food intake. Additional work has raised questions about the link between leptin secretion and body fat stores. In both lean and obese individuals, plasma leptin concentrations decrease during energy restriction. However, decreased plasma leptin concentrations associated with energy restriction in normal weight men and women were only partially explained by weight loss and were not associated with changes in body fat. Furthermore, in normal weight to obese women consuming an energy-restricted diet, leptin was only decreased significantly within the first week and then remained low, while body fat decreased more linearly throughout the 12-week trial. So all those people who are just like, what is going on? These are just basically points sort of stating that leptin may not be the key player here. Leptin was originally thought to be a long-term regulator of energy status, but evidence of short-term leptin regulation has also been reported. So under or overfeeding individuals for a 3-day period influences leptin concentrations when an eucaloric diet, which is basically a diet that maintains current weight, is restored, suggesting that leptin responds to short-term alterations in energy balance. The magnitude of increase with overfeeding or decrease with underfeeding in leptin greatly exceeded that expected if leptin was altered solely based on changes in body fat. In addition, a 7-day energy-restricted diet induced a significantly greater decrease in circulating leptin that could be explained by weight lost during the period. Leptin also negatively correlated with hunger, meaning that as leptin went up, hunger went down. And so after short-term changes in food consumption in lean individuals. However, when leptin was administered to obese individuals after a 10% weight reduction, it resulted in increased fullness following meals and a lower perceived food consumption, but no actual difference in food intake. So all of that stuff happened, but the food intake stays the same. In other words, people felt fuller, but they just ate the same amount of calories. Sort of, kind of. Although these studies suggest leptin serves as a short-term appetitive signal in normal weight individuals, plasma leptin concentrations exhibit a diurnal pattern and thus do not directly reflect changes in appetitive sensations during a 24-hour period. A lot of crazy science here, man. Lots of crazy science.
That was a mouthful, that one.
Yeah, like I said, people need to really go and circle back into this insanity, but if you start understanding what's going on over here, you are miles ahead of everybody else when it comes to understanding these basic concepts. Not so basic concepts. There is also evidence supporting short-term reduction of food intake by fatty acid oxidation. I think this is where some of our keto low-carb people can have a bit of an understanding. When mitochondrial beta oxidation that is, a cell's ability to turn fatty acids into energy is inhibited, rats on a medium, about 18% fat diet, exhibit a significant increase in food intake, while no effect is observed in rats on a low, about 3.3% fat diet. In addition, rodents and humans decrease food intake when consuming a diet rich in medium-chain triglycerides. That's one of our ingredients, isn't it? MCTs.
Yes.
So MCTs contain 8 carbon and 10 carbon saturated fatty acids. These are shorter chains, which can enter the portal vein directly and are rapidly oxidized once they reach the liver. Inhibiting fatty acid oxidation in the liver increases food intake in rats administered medium-chain triglycerides, or MCTs, while no effect is observed in response to long-chain triglycerols. In a human study, preloads containing MCTs significantly reduced food intake in non-dieting women during a meal provided 30 minutes later. But it had no effect on the overall, like by the end of the day, sort of, intake of the dieters. So it was short term. In contrast, several studies in both normal weight and obese individuals have shown that supplementing a meal with MCTs versus LCTs, medium-chain triglycerols, versus long-chain triglycerols has no effect on food intake or appetite ratings in a subsequent meal. However, when an additional MCT or LCT load of test oil was provided 1 hour before an all-you-can-eat style of meal, individuals who received the MCTs consumed significantly less. However, in a long-term study, not short-term, we were talking about short-term, so let's talk about long-term. In a long-term study of women with obesity administered a very low-energy diet supplemented by either MCTs or LCTs for 4 weeks, hunger ratings were lower and satiety ratings were higher after consuming MCT supplemented meals, but only during the first 2 weeks at 5 and 40 minutes following the meal. So it has a limited capacity. These findings suggest, conclusively, or maybe not so conclusively, that there may be a short-term effect of MCTs on food intake and satiety, but they do not extend to subsequent meals, and the body adapts to these changes if MCTs are consumed chronically. Just like everything, body seems to adapt, man. Just seems to adapt. Furthermore, the digestion of dietary fat influences appetite through its effect on gastric volume. So now we're getting into sort of like a mechanical zone. In a study where intragastric distension, and what I mean by intragastric distension is when you eat food, your stomach expands. That's basically the distension fact. So let's go back. In a study where intragastric distension was fixed to resemble fullness after a meal, an infusion of a fatty emulsion in the duodenum, which is the part of the small intestines right after the stomach, sort of like this pipeline. In this increased gastric volume and fullness ratings more than either a mixed nutrient or a protein solution. In another study, both LCT and MCT infusions increased gastric volume and fullness sensations, but not when administered along with a lipase inhibitor. Lipase, just to explain to everybody, lipase is an enzyme that is produced by our pancreas to break down fats into fatty acids and glycerols. All of this suggests, from this experiment, that the digestive products of triglyceride elicit these effects. Chemically, triglycerides are esters produced from glycerol and 3 fatty acids, and also a major component of body fat in humans. Sort of a little bit more technical. Compared to glucose supplemented meals, a high-fat meal elicited higher fullness ratings at any given gastric or stomach volume, despite the faster emptying rate and lower energy content of high carbohydrate meal. So, if anybody's still awake, let's conclude with this notion that these studies suggest that digestive products of dietary fat induce greater fullness sensation than other macronutrients. Observations that high-fat diets lead to passive overconsumption and weight gain in humans suggest that there is a weak inhibitory mechanism in place to prevent excess fat intake. In one exemplary study, individuals consumed more energy from an all-you-can-eat sort of meal containing an array of high-fat foods versus foods high in carbohydrates, suggesting the satiating properties of fat are not as potent as those of other macronutrients. So now we're sort of falsifying that. In addition, a breakfast supplemented with fat did not increase hunger ratings or energy intake of a snack provided 90 minutes later when compared to the breakfast without the additional fat. So the authors are proposing that a lack of inhibitory mechanisms to prevent excess fat consumption may have been beneficial when food was scarce and eating events did not occur often, but now that the fat is abundant in the food supply, it seems to enable weight gain. The observation that fat preference positively correlates with the percentage of body fat suggests that the palatability of this macronutrient contributes to overconsumption, which I kind of actually disagree with them. Have you ever tasted olive oil? It's disgusting and revolting.
Yeah, you really cannot drink even a quarter cup of that stuff without wanting to yak it up.
Yep. So this concludes our metabolic series. And this is a pretty good starting point, I would say, for beginning your nutrition and food insanity. I wouldn't take this as the gospel, but it really just hits a reset button on everything that you knew about food and nutrition. Corey, what's your take on this, or what's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is that I am surprised, and I am actually happy at the same time. I'm surprised because these things that we discovered about what our understanding about hunger and fullness and energy intake, we had felt that we had a grip on it, and we had felt that we had that with the glycemic index predicting hunger and energy intake later in the day was a nice thing to stand on, wasn't it? But then we just completely shattered some stuff here with this new study. But this is such a good thing. This is why I'm happy. We're continuing to learn.
Indeed, we are. So right now at this point, or at this junction in this three-parter, we're at this point where the evidence is rather inconclusive. And a lot of the things, I remember I used to buy into the whole protein leveraging thing. I used to buy into the fat is the most satiating macronutrients. But again, like I said, it depends on the context. And then if you ask a vegan or somebody who's a carbohydrate proponent, they'll talk about carbohydrates. But I think we're starting to finally converge towards where the problems might be when it comes to the bigger picture. Now, some people would argue over here and say that diet and nutrition is just one aspect. There are other factors that are in play as well, to which I would say I would agree. There's probably everything else that's out there that can also be a strong influencing factor. But this is where I go back to the house example. Was my house hit by a pebble, or was it hit by a tree? Just like that, I should ask, how substantial is that certain other factor that you're proposing? And is it a lifestyle choice? Is it a dietary choice? And then as a food company, we're here to learn as well. And we are here, we literally, this is, if you guys as listeners have been listening to us, we fell for all of this. We were proponents of a lot of these things that we talked about over here. We literally had to go out of we could have taken the easy way out and gotten into the whole marketing spiel. And we could have just been like, screw carbs, screw all of this stuff. Let's just do all of these things. But would that solve the problem? No, it won't. It won't solve anything. We'll just be back to square one. So this is why we're going out there and actively falsifying ourselves to understand more so we can help you guys more. And I think we're all done with the BS. We're done with all these associative studies. We're done with all of this nonsense. Everywhere there's nutrition, there's food, there's insanity. And all of these things, a lot of these things that you guys just heard have been falsified, or at least there's holes poking out of it. And so the next time you see a headline, just pause for a second and try to falsify it, or try to use the tools that you've learned by listening to this podcast and apply them. And even if you have a high school degree, you can do that. Basic statistics can go a long way. And so sharpen your tools of discernment.
Right. You just have to be willing to take off the horse blinders and stop looking down that tunnel. Widen your scope. Look everywhere you possibly can. If you were to lose your car keys in your house and you have to be at work in 5 minutes, you're going to turn over every dang rock in your house.
And this is your life we're talking about. This is health we're talking about. I know that it's not the biggest topic of discussion in your day, but it is by far the most important thing in your life, because this gives you can trade your time on earth for valuable experiences, for beautiful things. And there are people out there, they will age, they will grow older, and then some will grow older faster, some will get unhealthier faster. So you got to make these smart decisions right now and educate yourself better. And think constructive. Think about improving the world rather than taking people down. A lot of people in the low carb, keto, or vegan, a lot of these communities, they're more interested in taking people down rather than saying, you know what? There's a problem here. How can I help to make this world a better place? How can we come up with a better solution? If we have more people like that, I'm sure we can make some progress in the world.
This is precisely why we brought you through this exact episode, and why we gave you the forewarning that there may be some biological terms that we will have some difficulty pronouncing, and they're very difficult to understand as well. But after a few listens to this podcast, hopefully your knowledge increases, and that's our goal.
Exactly. And this is something that we shouldn't be doing. Like, I know I'm sounding like I'm complaining here, but this is something that a food company should not be doing. I mean, I appreciate that we're doing it, but this is the job of researchers. This is the job of people that are in nutrition and food that should be focusing on making and improving better foods. But no, a lot of these people are just stuck in their own dogmatic model, and they don't want to step out of it to falsify themselves so that we can collectively make the effort. And we should be more accepting of people's failures. I think that's very important in science, because we think of scientists as these perfect beings. You got to come up with the best. You got to come up with the best. No, you got to come up with something that actually helps. And if by your failure in research, or you've come up with a negative results, that's helping a lot. Like, this is all about, like we discovered, is active falsification right here. So that's what we need to focus on. You got something else to add?
Right. And I think it's just so important to shine the spotlight on this stuff. It's important to understand that these researchers are working really hard, and they're working very, very, very long hours on their research. And of course, they want to be proud of it. So therefore, it probably becomes hard to falsify your own stuff and reverse many years, hours, times, minutes of research that you've already done. And while with that said, there's two prongs here. Those researchers probably don't have enough time to give themselves a platform.
Yeah, they don't
get up there. So It's kind of very important that Ketogeek and other outside lab observers are able to read through these things, these research papers, understand what's going on, break them down into a simplicity that they can understand, that they can project onto the world as well. And it would be extra nice if we can even get some of these researchers their precious time and to confirm our understanding of their what they're saying in these papers. But this is what we need to do. We need our outside lab observers to read these papers for now, perhaps, and maybe we'll create something beautiful in the future where we have a center of data crunching, and it turns it into layman knowledge, and anybody can pick it up and understand it instantaneously.
Corey, at the end of our shows, we normally do, just to kind of start wrapping things up, we do a plug. And the person who comes onto the show says where they can find their book or their website or how people can contact them. I'm garbage with names. You've seen how I butchered biology. I don't want to do more butchering again. So if you can just kind of name all these authors that are in front of you, like these people, I think that would be a great way to sort of end it.
Right, yeah. Let's give these people a shout out. And I'll do my very best with the name pronunciations. Bear with me. So we have Alicia L. Carrero, Japna Dillon, Susanna Gordon, Ashley G. Jacobs, Kelly A. Higgins, Brianna M. MacArthur, Benjamin W. Radin, Rebecca L. Rivera, Leigh R. Schmidt, and finally, Richard D. Mattis.
You guys are all rock stars. I mean, it would be kind of awesome if they listened to our show. Just like saying, this is all your work. Like, all of this changed my mind. Please don't stop. And if anybody in your team wants to come up to our Ketogeek podcast to have a more detailed discussion on a certain topic, or you're coming up with a paper, please do reach out to us. I would love to have you on there. Anybody from who's like part of the Dr. Richards team, or anybody, you're always welcome to come over here and talk about some great science. I really love the paper trail that you guys have left online and everywhere when it comes to nutrition research. So, Corey, I think that's about it when it comes to Ketogeek and these heroes.
Absolutely.
Not to over-exaggerate everything. Thank you so much. And once again, you guys can go to ketogeek.com, where our energy pod is finally coming back on this coming Thursday. Chocolate Fudge Energy Pod. You guys can buy it up and leave a review for this podcast on whatever you find, Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, wherever you can find it. Just leave likes and reviews or comments. Really appreciate it. So yeah, buy the product or leave us a review. Ideally, do both. So thank you so much, guys. And Corey, I think we're done.
Without further ado, goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the show. You can visit us at ketogeek.com to check out our premium keto-friendly and low-carb food products, including our infamous energy pods, made from the best ingredients we could find in the entire country. We also recommend signing up for our newsletter at ketogeek.com/signup, where you get exclusive discounts, rewards, product announcements, and the latest content we are working on. You also get a 10% discount on your entire order when you sign up. Go to ketogeek.com/signup to join the low-carb playground.